So our next speaker is Charles Perreault. Charles is an associate professor at the School of Human Evolution and Social Change and research scientist in the Institute of Human Origins at Arizona State University. Major focus of Charles' work lay at the intersection of archaeology and evolutionary anthropology. He works to better understand how archaeological data can contribute to cultural evolution theory, much in the same way as paleontology interacts with genetic theory. Thus, he is particularly interested in how cultural evolution processes unfold at both the micro and the macro scale, and how one can transit between these two different observational scales. His current research includes taking advantage of the large-scale nature of the archaeological record in order to parameterize current models of cultural evolution, estimating the pace of cultural evolution as seen in the archaeological record, and comparing it to rates of biological evolution as seen in the fossil record. So Charles' talk today is titled Technological Evolution, How Humans Adapt to Their Environment. Modern humans use technologies to adapt and transform their environments. So his talk is going to be discussing how technological adaptations emerge, i.e. cultural evolution, and what the archaeological record tells us about when this capacity for cultural evolution appears. So please welcome Charles to the podium. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, and thank you. So Johannes asked me to talk about how humans adapt to their environment through technologies. But for me to be able to do that, I need to set up the table a little bit, so to speak. So here at the Institute of Human Origins, our big scientific quest is to understand the evolutionary history of our species. And what that means is it means to uncover all the series of historical events and evolutionary forces that took a run-of-the-mill arboreal primate like this Miocene ape and turned it into this large-bodied, big-brained, bipedal, awesome technology-wielding organisms that we are today. Now, had a biologist, an extraterrestrial biologist from a faraway galaxy, flown over the Earth 7 million years ago and conducted a survey of the fauna and the flora on the planet, they may not have even noticed our ancestor, right? They may have noticed it, but they wouldn't have thought much about it. It would have been just another species. Nothing about them made them stood out. Now, if the same extraterrestrial biologists were to conduct the same survey today, it would just be impossible to miss humans, right? You'd have to be really blind to miss humans. Impossible to miss because of our sheer number, right? 8 billion and counting. That is a staggering number for a vertebrate of our size. Impossible to miss because of our range area. And you find humans, you find traces of human activity in every nook and crannies of the planet. Impossible to miss because of the technological environments that we build for ourselves, like these cities. So you have this species that is just really unique today, that really stands out. And it cannot be a coincidence that this also just happens to be the first species in the history of life to have evolved, to have developed a secondary inheritance system in addition to the genetic one. You know, something extraordinary happened on the planet, probably over the last million years or so. We don't know exactly when. An organism acquired a second inheritance system. Our first system, of course, is the genetic one, right? It is based on the replication of DNA. Genetic evolution is the main way by which animal species adapt to their environment. But not that we're species Homo sapiens, right? Homo sapiens, in addition to that genetic inheritance system, have a second system that we call culture. And by culture, I do not mean arts or the high intellectual achievements of an era. Culture here is used in a very specific sense that we use in biology, and culture is information that affects the behavior of individuals, right? It'll affect how they think, what they do, how they use the material around them, and it is information that is transmitted from one individual to another through social learning, okay? When a child observes you and imitates the way you hold a fork, that is social inheritance. Now, culture in humans is an evolutionary system. It's an evolutionary system that can lead to cultural adaptations to the environment. And when I say culture is an evolutionary system, it's not a metaphor. It is not a cute, imperfect metaphor. Genetics may be the dominant evolutionary system on the planet, but it's also just one particular instantiation of what an evolutionary system can be. Imagine that we discover a life form on another planet, right? And this life form, this replication of information, it is subjected to natural selection, it evolves, it adapts. Now the details will be different, right? The details will be different. The biochemistry underlying that life form is probably going to be different than the biochemistry of life on Earth. And yet, despite these differences, you would not want to call that evolution, right? It is the same reasoning that you can apply to culture. If you have variation among individuals, if that variation is heritable, and if that variation somehow makes it, for some reason, is more likely to be passed on to the next generation than other variants, perhaps because they're a better fit to the environment, you will have adaptations emerging, right? These are Darwin's 3 postulates for natural selection. And there's nothing about them that's specific to DNA. Culture can, not always, but sometimes can meet those 3 criteria. Therefore, cultural adaptations emerge. Now, of course, there are many differences between genes and culture, right? Culture is probably not based on some replicator unit that is analogous to genes, right? Whereas genetic information is information that is stored in our cells, culture is stored in our brains. Now, you're probably not going to find gene-like units of cultural information in people's brain in their neural network, right? This individual here who's learning how to start a fire by observing someone else, you will not find copies of neural networks associated encoding fire making, fire production in their brains. And that is fine. That is fine. Variants do not have to make physical, material copies of themselves to have the kind of population level dynamics that lends itself to evolution. The source of variations are different, right? The main source of genetic variation is random mutation. You know that. There's something analogous to this in culture. We call these imitation error. I'm an apprentice potter. You're a master potter. I'm doing my best to make my vessels exactly like yours, but maybe I make a little error, right? Maybe the base of my vessels is a little bit smaller. It's barely noticeable. I don't even notice it. You don't notice it. But those small errors, they can accumulate over time, over generation, and lead to significant changes in design. Other source of variation would include discovery, right? Discovery is when an individual learns something new about the environment on their own, okay? Maybe someone notices that the phase of the moon and the tides appear to be correlated, right? And that discovery is passed on socially to other individuals, and then it becomes leveraged and leads to improved coastal foraging practices, right? This is something that my IHO colleague, Curtis Marion, has documented in the prehistory of the coast of South Africa. Invention can lead to new variants, right? Conscious, goal-oriented modifications that are made by individuals who are looking explicitly, consciously for better alternatives, better ways of doing things. And of course, diffusion, right? Diffusion can bring new variants in a group, whether it's through migration or the spread of ideas. the modes of transmission between genes and culture will differ, right? The main primary predominant mode of transmission in genes is vertical, right? Information is transmitted from parents to offspring. Culture can also be transmitted from parents to offspring, but it may just as well be transmitted horizontally among peers, one to many, as in a classroom, or many to one, right? As in it takes a village to raise a child. With culture, unlike with genes, individuals can acquire new variants continuously throughout their life, change their behavior throughout their life. That's going to have a big impact on how fast culture can change. And the forces of change are different, right? Differential reproductive success is the main thing that affects the frequency of genes in the population over time. This may happen for culture, but it's not the main way by which the frequency of cultural variants change in the population over time. Now, culture can change completely independently of genes. It doesn't have to impact the biological survival of individuals for it to happen. Now, there's a suite of cognitive mechanism, learning biases, social learning biases, features of the human brain that have probably been tweaked and designed by natural selection that affect how we socially learn from each other, who we decide to learn from, which variants we're more likely to adopt, and which variant we're less likely to adopt. Now, these learning biases, they're pretty complex. The truth is we still don't fully understand them. We don't know exactly, you don't have an exhaustive list for them. We still don't fully understand how they interact with each other, but we have some clue, right? For instance, in some contexts, it's certainly possible for individuals to compare the costs and benefits of different subsistence practices, different bow design, for instance, and adopt the practice that has the variant that has the greatest payoff associated with it. Now, that's not always possible. You can't always do that. In which case, individuals may be more likely to adopt the successful individuals in their group or the prestigious one. Or they may conform to the group, right? Just do what the majority of people around you are doing. When in Rome, do as the Roman. Now, you have all these differences between genes and cultures. Sometimes these differences, they matter. Sometimes these differences matter. Sometimes cultural evolution will lead, because of these differences, it will lead to outcomes that you would never predict from a purely biological evolution point of view. But many times, in many contexts, those differences turn out to not matter very much. There's been a lot of mathematical modeling work that is very mirroring the kind of population genetics modeling that's been at the foundation of population genetics and biology that's been done since the mid-'80s that show that despite these differences, under a wide range of conditions, cultural adaptations can emerge, and they will emerge easily and rapidly. So the net effect, is this a pointer? Maybe not. The net effect of these social learning biases that I just alluded to, this learning psychology of humans, thank you, all right, it will create at the population level, right? You zoom out from a single individual and you see how these learning biases add up at the population level in a social group. And what it creates at the population level this machine, this filtering mechanism, this sieve, that can be very efficient at sifting and keeping technologies that are better fit to the environment, and these variants are more likely to be retained in the population. Perhaps it's a better way to insulate your shelter, right? So up here on the left side, you have this social group. The blue, I'm afraid, is a bit hard to read here, but you have this social group. And perhaps because of an imitation error or a stroke of genius, a lucky error, this individual here in yellow comes up with a better design, like a better way to weave, a different way to weave a fishing net. Now, initially it's rare, right? There's only one individual with that variant in the population. But because through social learning and all these biases, the new design increases in frequency. Maybe because people see that the nets are, well, they're faster to build, or they last longer, or more fish get caught in it, whatever the reason, the frequency of that trait increases in the population, and eventually it becomes the dominant trait in the population, the main variant. That is technological adaptation. Right? That is technological adaptation. And within the same tradition, you can have multiple rounds of this over hundreds of years, over thousands of years. And what starts rare and then becomes common are small tweaks, modifications, improvements, maybe some inventions. And the result are technologies that increase in complexity over time, like this Inuit harpoon. It has many parts, including moving parts, right, mobile parts. And all these different parts are all made of different raw material. This design here is the outcome of thousands of years of experience, of trial and error, of refinement and tests, hundreds of thousands of days of hunting success, hundreds of thousands of days of hunting failure, of coming back home with nothing, of figuring out which raw material is best for which part of the harpoon. But if you're a child born in the Middle Dorset period, you don't have to worry about any of that. All you have to do is do what mom and dad do. And you are inheriting, without realizing it, thousands of lives worth of experiment. I mean, how extraordinary. And this process, it impacts technologies, it is how humans adapt technologically to their environment, but it will also impact knowledge, ecological knowledge, knowledge about the weather, about where resources are distributed in an area, knowledge about plants and animals and their behavior, where and when you can find them, how to process them. It'll impact social norms, institutions. This is an extraordinarily powerful adaptive mechanism. And in our field, we refer to it as cumulative culture. Cumulative culture, that's because all these modifications and improvements, they accumulate in the population over time. And I know that my colleague, Robert Boyd, has given a great lecture on cumulative culture as part of this speaker series, so you should look it up. And these two inheritance systems, culture and biology, they can operate fairly independently of each other, right? And that's because they typically operate over very different time scales. But they can also interact, right? They can also interact. New cultural traits, I'm afraid this is dead. New cultural traits can generate new selective pressure on genes. Okay, for instance, the practice of cooking food may have led to changes in the digestive system of our ancestors, in their gut, their teeth, right, the size and the morphology of their teeth. And as the body of our ancestors are becoming better at digesting cooked food and increasingly more bad at digesting raw food, well, this increases the pressure or makes fire technology and cooking knowledge and cooking technology increasingly beneficial. So you have this feedback loop here. Language is probably another example of this gene-culture coevolution loop. In fact, culture, once it appeared, it may have been one of the main selective pressure on the bodies of our ancestors. And once an organism has two inheritance systems like this, boy, are you in for a ride, right? That's when the rocket lifts off. And that's because these two systems, they're very complementary with each other. They're very complementary with each other. Cultural adaptations can emerge over very short timescales compared to biological adaptations. So in biology, you have this spectrum. This is a simplification of it, but it gets to the idea. You have a spectrum. On the one end of that spectrum, you have species that can adapt rapidly to their environment, okay, right here. So this is the bottom axis here of this chart. The rates of evolution are fast. These species can adapt rapidly And that's because they have a very short lifespan, right? That's also on left side of the chart. They have a very short lifespan. So there's a high generational turnover. They can adapt quickly, right? Every few weeks, there's a new generation. But the trade-off is that they have a very small body size, right? Think of worms and fruit flies. On the other hand, you have species that live longer. They have very large bodies, but they will evolve more slowly because they have a long generation time, like elephants. Humans will be more or less here, right? This is probably a log scale. So there's this generation time constraint here, and every species would have to fall somewhere along that line, right? It is a constraint, a biological trade-off. But what culture does is it frees us from that generation time constraint. It gives us the best of both worlds. It lets us dip our fingers on both ends of that spectrum. It allows us to evolve over time scales that are very short, that normally would only be accessible to species with a very, very short lifespan, like fruit flies. While at the same time, it allows us to enjoy the benefit of having a long lifespan, right? Lots of time to develop, lots of time to learn all the stuff and acquire all that culture you need to survive, to enjoy large bodies, walk around with those big brains sloshing in our skull, right? That is how we've become such a powerful and unique species. And technology is the main way by which humans adapt culturally to their environment. Technology is the main way by which humans solve the mismatch between their bodies and their environment. It is with technology that humans have been able to occupy and spread and occupy the entire world so rapidly without having to wait for slow biological adaptations to evolve, right? For biological evolution, biological adaptations to all those climates we inhabit today. And the result is this amazing cultural variation that we see among populations, right? It is the reason why we travel. It's one of the main reasons why we travel, is to enjoy this and observe all this amazing variation we see among people. People in different parts of the world wear different types of clothing, believe in different gods, speak different language, use different subsistence technologies, food processing technologies. They build all these dwellings, right? This is just a small subset of the kind of dwellings that humans build, but it is an amazingly diverse array of technology. All of those dwellings are amazingly well adapted to their environment, adapted to the kind of raw material that's available to them, to the kind of challenges these shelters need to solve, the jobs these shelters need to accomplish. So in the end, the emergence of this secondary inheritance system, it may be one of the most consequential events in the history, in the course of human evolution, but also in the history of life on the planet. And IHO has one of the best teams in the world on this topic. At IHO, we use archaeological research, we use ethnographic fieldwork, we use cross-cultural studies, we use experiments, we use modeling to understand how that secondary inheritance system works, what makes it tick. This is a fairly new field. There's still so much we don't understand. We've barely scratched the surface. There's still much to learn about it. Now, maybe you're an ASU student, you're watching this online, right? And maybe you find cultural evolution interesting. Maybe you find the idea of this dual inheritance system intriguing. Well, these are the IHO faculty that teach classes that are connected to that topic, to cultural evolution. We teach classes on the emergence of technologies, on stone tools, right? The history of early modern humans, how humans learn from each other from a cognitive, psychological, developmental point of view, how culture allows humans to cooperate over large scale. So if you find this interesting, look these people up, take one of our classes, and we're going to talk about these beautiful ideas. Thank you.